I'm Courtney at womenlivingwell.org, home of Good Morning Girls, and we are reading through the Bible cover to cover. And so this week you completed week 2 in our study in the book of Ruth. And so today I want to talk about the one key to living well, because we are going to look at the first 6 characters in Ruth chapter 1, and we're going to compare and contrast the way that they lived. Did they live well? You see, 4 of the characters wanted to live a more comfortable, cozy life, but 2 of them, the 2 that decided to follow God, were taken way outside their comfort zone in order to remain inside the will of God. You see, they had to go outside in order to remain inside. And you know what, to be honest, I like a comfy, cozy life. I pray that God will bless me, that God will protect for me and provide for me, and I want to live a comfortable life. But the truth is, the danger of the comfortable, cozy Christian life is that God's best work is done outside of our comfort zone. I mean, if you really think about it, think about Moses. When he was leading the Israelites out of Egypt and his back was up against the Red Sea, I don't think that he was very comfortable. But when God parted the Red Sea, boom, God showed himself and he did his greatest work right there. And then we think about Daniel in the lion's den. I'm sure he wasn't comfortable. And Mary carrying baby Jesus in her womb. And I also think about the disciples and when Jesus came to them and he told them to drop their nets and to come and follow him and become fishers of men. I'm sure it was hard for them to leave their careers behind. And I think of Peter when he stepped out of the boat and walked on the water. So many of the godly men and women of faith had to go way outside their comfort zone in order to remain inside the will of God. And this makes me think of one of my favorite authors and favorite missionaries. Her name is Elizabeth Elliot. If you haven't heard of her, she was a missionary to the Auca Indians. And she and her husband Jim Elliot went to the Auca Indians, and there they murdered Jim. They speared him to death. And after she was done grieving the loss of her husband, she actually returned to the Auca Indians with the gospel. She stayed on mission, and there they were led to the Lord and they were saved. And that was a woman that went way outside her comfort zone, but she was right in the center of God's will. And so when I was in college back in 1994, so I'm dating myself a little bit, she came to speak at the Moody Bible Institute at a conference, and so it was just so awesome to hear her speak. And then after that, she came to our dorm floor, and there 60 of us girls sat in chairs and on the floor, just sat at her feet to hear her wisdom. And I'll never forget the verses that she used because I wrote them down in my journal. And she quoted from John 12:24 and 25, and it's Jesus speaking there, and he says, "Unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. He who loves his life will lose it." And so Jesus says, if you love your life, die, lose it. He uses that kernel of wheat as an example, and he says if a kernel of wheat falls on the ground and doesn't die, it just lays there. But if it dies, it produces life. It becomes fruitful. And so he says if we will die to ourselves, that Jesus will make us fruitful. And so I'm reminded of Luke 9:23, where Jesus says, if any man will come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. There is this denial of ourselves. The key to living well is learning to die well. It's learning to deny ourselves. It's willing to go outside our comfort zone in order to remain inside the will of God. And so that brings us up to Ruth chapter 1 and our 6 main characters. And so I'm going to quickly go through these 6 characters, comparing and contrasting them. The first one is Elimelech. And we saw there that he is the father, that he is the godly leader, right, of his home, and he is the provider and the protector. And he wants to provide for his family because there's a famine in the land of Bethlehem. And so he takes his family from God's people, from God's land, and he takes them to Moab where there is food. And while I believe it was good that he wanted to provide for them, I think he wanted to be comfortable too. And rather than trusting in God to provide for God's people and God's land, he went outside their land to provide. And then his sons ended up marrying Moabite women. And I think they probably wanted to be comfortable and cozy. It was the easier thing to do to marry Moabite women, even though God forbid them to intermarry with the Moabites. You see, the sons would have had to walk 50 to 80 miles, right, to go find wives, and the Moabite women were just right there. And so they end up, the father and the two sons, dying. And so one of the sons' wives, Orpah, returns to her land. She stays with her people, with the Moabites. And because that's comfortable, that's what was cozy, that's what she knew. But then we have Ruth and Naomi. Despite the choices of the men and all of that, this is where our God works best, right? He is faithful. And so Ruth and Naomi decide to do the very uncomfortable walk, that 50 to 80-mile walk that ironically the sons were not willing to make. They make all the way back to Bethlehem to return to God's people, to return to the place of worship where they can worship their God. And so we see that they go outside their comfort zone, and eventually Ruth will do a lot of uncomfortable things, right? She's going to work in the fields. She's going to lay down at Boaz's feet, which I'm sure was uncomfortable. And so she was willing to live a risky life as she trusted God with his plans for her. And so they had to go outside their comfort zone in order to remain inside the will of God. And I'm wondering today, is God asking you to do something that's uncomfortable? Unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. And you might be saying, God isn't asking me to do something uncomfortable today, Courtney. I am uncomfortable. I've been doing a lot of things, and life is hard, and I am uncomfortable. And I think that we can be tempted when we are uncomfortable to think that maybe our neighbor who lives next door, who doesn't follow Jesus, who looks like their life is perfect, it can be tempting to think, well, maybe I'm outside God's will because I'm in the midst of a lot of stress and a lot of hard things. But actually, that is where God often shows himself most faithful, that he takes us into the wilderness. He takes us sometimes into those hard things to show himself to us so that we can fully see his glory as he works out his plan in our lives. And that's what's going to happen in the book of Ruth, because at the start of the book of Ruth, we see death, right, in just the first few verses, but it's going to end in Ruth chapter 4 with life as a baby is born. And he's going to take the women from Naomi feeling bitter to her being blessed. And he takes them from despair to hope. And that is the same way God works in our lives. He is sovereign over all the setbacks, over all the hard things, over all the unknown in our lives. He is sovereign, and he is a good God, and we can trust him with his plan for our lives. So don't be afraid to go outside of your comfort zone, to remain inside the will of God, because the key to living well is learning to die well. It's learning to deny ourselves, take up the cross daily, and just follow him no matter where he takes us. Keep walking with the King.